I guess it's maybe useful to talk about the relationships between my work and traditional imagery. I, have a part of my practice is oriented towards maybe a critique or reworking of the tropes, probably more documentary than narrative film. And I think at a certain point I began to realize there were always going to be gaps in the archival imagery that I recruited to the projects that I was doing. And so at a certain point it seemed sensible to me to try to reduce or remove those things and rely maybe more on the memory and desire for images than actually supplying them or resupplying them or reinterpreting them. Or in some cases it seemed more interesting and more productive to not reproduce the images as such, but to rather, again, rely on the memory and imagination of the viewer for the kinds and classes of imagery that I might be referring to. It's interesting. I think one of the things I was thinking about when I heard the question was a kind of questioning of what counts, as evidence, or what counts as representation, or what counts as maybe historiography and a kind of public record. And it seemed to me, kind of in conversation with people like Paul Gilroy, that it was, for many Black people, music was kind of historiography and literature and art in ways that perhaps those registers were not available or not being worked with to describe experiences of Africans in the diaspora globally. And so I guess it was in part a kind of desire to foreground those ways in which music could operate that I made the decision to concentrate on kind of music and its potentials, both affective and structural, as a way of representing and thinking through Black lives and how they were represented and experienced. Yeah, definitely. I think that desire for remainders, revenants, echoes, you could even say amplifications of previous existing questions, and you could say even historical and political events, became a really strong and marked interest for me. And I think sound again figures in that, in the way that sound maybe triggers memory and relates to the body in a different way than, say, image making or even reading, which is also a strong component of my work, operate. And I like that idea that history kind of is still with us, and in a kind of almost literal way, I think the sound recording is something that becomes part of one's environment, but also evokes specific places, histories, both personal and social. I think some people would disagree with me. I know that when I started to do works that were maybe more explicitly about the art world and its discourses, some people thought that there was something limited or limiting about that choice. But in a way, I felt like, and I often feel this way, I think, when I'm working with material, that sometimes the specific is a kind of pathway to a general or theoretical idea. And so if you take something that is present for one, or a kind of history of relationships to institutions, for instance, that can be a very concrete way of talking about wider social phenomena and structures. And so for me, it's kind of a calculated risk. It's like, I think some people will be interested, I think maybe artists and people who are involved in those discourses and fields will be interested. But I hope that it shows also the ways in which what is once thought to be separate and discrete from the rest of the world is actually very much a part of it and very much a part of its structures. Yeah, I think the commonplace, the vernacular, have always been a kind of a site and location for a certain rethinking or repositioning of elements. I, have a certain attraction, repulsion with certain of the codes of modernist aesthetics and design, even though I'm not a designer and I'm not maybe particularly adept at it, as a kind of field or modality, but it has also had a really large influence on maybe the way that I see things and think about things visually, and I think to some extent that may be true for a lot of people who don't consider themselves, artists or designers. And I think maybe I came, to my practice through a long and circuitous route, and maybe to some extent the passage through certain design cultures, especially those associated with popular music, are part of the reason why I do things that I do and choose the sort of circuits and relationships that I do. For me, it's always interesting to look for, I don't think you could call them hidden structures as much as maybe implicit structures in things. Like, for instance, in Testament A, the piece that reworks a talk that Kodjo Eshun did as a memorial to Mark Fisher, I was interested very much in what his reciting of the text did rhythmically, and the ways in which that rhythm in speech can function almost as a memory device or as a kind of affective register that wouldn't necessarily be reproduced if you read that essay on a page. And I was particularly interested in trying to maybe capture, that supplement, that rhythm and recitation and that tonality can bring to a given text. Often, I think I take texts that may or may not have a kind of general voice or general, readership or positioning. But for that one in particular, I was interested in establishing or trying to mimic the rhythm of that presentation. And it kind of, in a strange way, almost in a kind of mirror way, rehearses maybe the way that I think about how I subdivide a text when I'm presenting it. Because it's so explicit maybe in that work. It made me think about, how do I make those decisions? Sometimes I use, very general rubrics, systems, like every word or every, so-called sub-phrase of a given sentence. And each, I think, has a kind of very particular meter and a very particular affect attached to it. I think lately I've tended towards maybe more phrase-oriented and readerly kinds of constructs as opposed to more abstract systems and positioning. I think often I'm either trying to consider particular cultural conditions for the making and circulation of work, or I want to kind of respond in some way and rethink in some way existing constituents in relationship to a particular space. And when I think about exhibitions and exhibition making, I often think about the question of how to present, what histories am I acknowledging or suppressing in the choices that I make, if there are ways, at least for me, to reread and re-explore the conditions of possibility for these existing works, to kind of make them new for me and make them new for viewers. People often ask me, especially in institutional context, is there a kind of default for presentation of a given work? And my tendency would be to say these are ways that it has been presented in the past, but more often than not, I'm willing to consider other sort of constellations, other versions, and other positionings of the work. I think for me, it's also a way of kind of keeping working processes and thinking active as opposed to maybe solidified. Maybe that's one of the reasons why, a number of years ago I chose to call myself a post-conceptualist. I don't see myself as a traditional filmmaker, narrative, or experimental, though I may borrow certain attributes and techniques. It's like I'm not so much interested in those kinds of traditional genres, I'm much more interested in what possibilities there might be. And I think that may be tied to my interest in paths, and their recurrences in the present and futures.